Right, well, I think we'll make a start. Good evening again, everybody. Those of you who've already heard me going on about the future events. I'm Clive Booth, president of the Oxford Civic Society. These talks are open to members and non-members. So I hope that if you are not already a member, you will join the society, because we have a huge range of interesting activities over and above these talks. You can go to our website and find out more about it. It's easy to join by, if you go to the website, clicking on the Join Now button. The annual sub is only £5 for students and 15 for individuals and £25 for joint membership. Before introducing this evening's speaker, I'd like to outline how we hope to proceed. Our session will last for about an hour. We don't stick rigidly to that, but about an hour. The talk will take around about 45 minutes, after which there'll be an opportunity for audience members to ask questions or make comments. We'll be recording this talk so that it can be accessed later on YouTube, should you want to revisit it or recommend it to your friends and neighbors. During the talk, your microphones will be muted, but you can submit your questions or comments at any time using the chat facility, which, depending on the type of device you use, will be either on the top line or the bottom line of your screen. At the end of the talk, our Vice Chair, Gillian Coates, will take over from me for the question and answer session. So now to the topic for this evening. Dr. Bob Colenutt's distinguished career in the School of Built Environment at Oxford Brookes University and as head of research at the Northampton Institute of Urban Affairs, and indeed as chairman of the Oxford Community Land Trust, has given him a ringside seat to observe the arcane workings of the contemporary housing market. Last year, he published a very well-received book entitled The Property Lobby: The Hidden Reality Behind the Housing Crisis. I'm pleased to say he's an active member of Oxford Civic Society's housing group. His theme tonight is how the planning system was captured by the property lobby. Bob, welcome, and over to you. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I've been invited to give this talk by the Civic Society. I'm grateful for being asked to talk about my book and about its implications. I feel a certain level of awe about talking to Civic Society because there's so many incredibly well-informed people about planning and development, and I probably need to tread quite carefully because of that. But in any case, here goes. Last year, I published a book called The Property Lobby. Its subtitle is The Hidden Reality Behind the Housing Crisis. This is a book really that arises out of some years of research and engagement with the planning system as a resident of different places, as a local councillor in part of London, as a researcher on urban affairs and development, and working as a local planning officer in local government. So I come with all that sort of background and experience, and that's a lot of that is gone into this book. And the sort of starting point for the book, and the reason why I wrote it really was a sense of sort of immense frustration that despite, over the years, thousands of brilliant reports and statistics on housing need and the state of the housing crisis in this country, and the importance, repeated statements about the importance of good placemaking, visits of people to European countries to see best practice. Despite all of this, over decades, the housing and planning crisis goes on, and arguably it gets worse. So that's the starting point. I mean, why is this? And I argue in the book that the planning system in the UK has been steadily weakened over some years. Planners have become demonized as responsible for many of the ills of the country for some reason. And this has really been going on since the 1980s. Broadly, as markets have become more powerful in policy making and in our lives, the public sector, including planning, has got weaker, because planning really is fundamentally part of the public sector and the public interest. That has got weaker. The other side of that coin is that the land and property market, especially volume house building, has become dominant in the economy, in investment, and in government economic management. And a familiar symptom of this can be found in this chart, which is familiar probably to many of you, which shows levels of house building over the last 50 or 60 years, starting in the post-war period and going up almost to the present day. And the different colors on this chart is the blue, local authority house building, which accelerated in the post-war period, peaked in the mid-60s, and then went down and down and down and almost completely disappeared by the 1990s. And the brown is the house builders that were building relatively little in the post-war period, but then established a level of house building around 200,000 units a year or less from 1996. And it's been at that level ever since, for 40 years or so. The volume house builders, despite all the ups and downs in the economy, have produced about the same amount of housing. And then to sort of compensate, I suppose, for the collapse of the termination public house building, there's been some increase in housing association house building, but this has been at a relatively small level and contributes relatively little to the total amount of new house building in the UK. So what's happened really in the whole of the post-war period is that the level of house building in this country has dropped dramatically from the sort of 1950s period to the late 70s, and has remained at a relatively low level really since the 1980s, precisely the period during which planning has become rather demonized. And some people have drawn the conclusion that the reason for that is because of planning. And my book and many other people have argued this is, of course, completely not the case, but we need to explore that hypothesis. Now, what I argue is that there's a finance house building complex that now dominates the land and housing market, in the same way that people in the 1950s were talking about a military industrial complex, which was kind of sweeping up the sort of government and the defense industries into one sort of formidable finance and political complex. We now have something different, but similar in many ways, the finance house building complex, which is a combination of very, very powerful financial interests and house building. Now, what's part of this complex? It includes large landowners across the country, the 10 largest volume house builders, Barratt's, Persimmons, Wimpey's, and so on, all of the major banks, the mortgage companies, and the investors. So this is a significant, coalescence of power and interest that is being organized. And this body has vastly more influence with government and in the direction of the economy than the pro-planning and pro-housing need lobbies. All the work, the Shelter and Crisis and Roundtree Foundation, the Town and Country Planning Association, the Royal Town Planning Institute, skillful and well evidenced as they are in their reports and in their lobbies, they really have relatively little influence over the development process in the country compared to the finance house building complex. But just drilling down a little bit further into what is the property lobby. I mean, it's not, one sort of conspiracy of people sitting around together organizing anything, organizing the land and housing market and determining what happens in planning. But it is an extraordinarily well organized and well funded lobby. And it has immense influence in Whitehall and in local government. They have direct influence to ministers in a way that those other organizations I was talking about simply don't have. Now, who's in this lobby? Well, it includes, the increasingly significant Home Builders Federation, to which most of the volume house builders belong, the British Property Federation, to which most of the big investors and commercial office developers belong, the Land Promoters and Developers Association Federation, which is increasingly important because they go around acquiring land on behalf of these other interests and in advance of those other interests. The Country Land and Business Association, the CLA, which represents major landowners and lots of small landowners and farmers. And then, of course, the Residential Landlords Association, which brings together landlords for the increasingly important and dominant private renting market. So that's one part of the lobby. Another part of the lobby is the strictly finance side. UK Finance, which used to be called the UK Bankers Association, brings together a lot of major banks and mortgage companies, and they're all kind of merging together now in UK Finance, and it includes the Association of Real Estate Funds. But that's not all, and we must not forget the really important role in the property lobby of the property professions, particularly the RICS, which has got this sort of dual role of sort of being, a professional accrediting body, but also brings together a lot of important interests in determining the nature of planning and valuation, and it's got very much a market-oriented tilt. And then there's the major consultancies, Savills and all the big sort of major planning consultants. They're all extremely important in this debate as well. And because most of their commissions come from the private sector, they also have this sort of land and property market tilt. Even though they do work for local authorities, of course, their major tilt and their kind of their sort of center of gravity is towards the land and housing market. And then very importantly, and this is what my book kind of spells out, is that government officials are also quite well integrated into this complex, particularly in the Treasury. Government, sees the property lobby as a source of advice on economic management, on development in the country, on the mortgage market. And so that's their first port of call. Their first port of call is not to shelter or crisis or the Royal Town Planning Institute, is towards these other bodies. And so what this means is that, there is this increasing influence of the property lobby on government and vice versa. And, many recent studies have shown there's increasing amount of revolving doors going on between government and consultancies and property agencies and the RICS, local government councillors, local government officers, and the property lobby. They're becoming increasingly they're not just working in partnership, which is a polite word, they're becoming sort of integrated in terms of their value system. And this question of vested interests is extremely, sort of controversial, really, because it touches on what I see as a kind of a really serious problem emerging within planning and within the housing market, and that's a very British form of corruption taking place, with politicians receiving donations, political donations, in return for various kind of favours. And the classic cases of these, which we've recently seen, is Boris Johnson receiving donations to his political fund after waiving planning conditions on a couple of major developments in London. And of course, Robert Jenrick, the current Secretary of State, speeding up major housing consents for that site on the Isle of Dogs, a luxury housing development being proposed by Richard Desmond, a Tory donor. So this kind of chummy relationship, which leads to oiling the wheels, is increasingly common, unfortunately. And even in Grenfell, which is now the subject of much controversy, we find out through the Grenfell inquiry some quite astonishing facts that Arconic, the company that made Grenfell's cladding, was donating regularly money to the Conservative Party, even in the year that the Grenfell disaster took place. So this is the extent of the integration. It's not just with major house builders, it's with a whole raft of people involved in the construction and development sector, putting money into the Tory party because they see them as furthering their interests. And the Tories received 11 million in donations from property developers since July 2019, when Johnson became Prime Minister. And nearly a quarter of total Tory donations from July 19 to March 2020 came from the property sector. So the property sector and the Conservative Party are very, I'm not saying that property developers don't fund occasionally other parties, but the predominant source of their funding is towards the Conservative Party. Okay, so what is the result of this? The result is, hugely significant for not just national planning policy, but also for local planning decisions. Market factors and market values, market thinking have become more important than social and environmental factors in plans and planning decisions. So despite the fact that there is, huge amount of public concern about the environment, climate change, and inequality, social problems, deprivation, market factors have become more decisive in making planning decisions than those other parts of planning. So the sort of three things that make up sustainable development: economic, social, environmental. The economic, the market, trumps social and environmental most of the time. So the consequence of this is that land value, rather than land use, has taken over the planning system. The original planning system, 1947, was about land use. It was specifically ruling out the profitability of land, or the characteristics or the needs of a particular land owner, and instead was saying that land use in the public interest was the determining factor in drawing out plans and determining planning applications. That was the case, more or less, until 2012. And the 2012 National Planning Policy Guidance introduced this quite astonishing change, which was introducing the notion of viability assessment, which meant that, viability issues could trump. Now officially, unofficially that could have been the case before, but now officially it could trump social and environmental factors in plans and planning decisions, so that even though local communities and local authorities might spend years drawing up plans and setting out standards and things, they could be trumped if developers said, well, these standards or these requirements for affordable housing made their schemes unviable. And that became built into the planning system in 2012 and has now been continued in the latest MPPF 2019. So this is really serious stuff. And that, in my views, is the most important change in the planning system since 1947. It's literally formally introduced the notion of profitability into land use decisions, whereas previously it was specifically ruled out by the 1947 Act. So that sustainable development, rather than being this kind of balance between market, environment, and social issues, effectively means commercially viable development. And that's how serious things have got. It follows from that, and it's part of this, that house builders and their demands for land have become the dominant driver of government planning policy and local plans, especially since 2010. And it was happening before that, but now it is, it's formal government policy that targets for house building, new house building that is a dominant factor in government policy, which means that the requirements of house builders for more land to be allocated for housing it follows from that. Of course, the Land Promoters Association and things like that have come about in order to obtain options on land so that this government target can be met, which is a kind of aggregate target over the whole country. Does it make sense like that? I don't know, but that is the dominant driver of government planning policy. And if you read almost all government planning documents since 2010, despite mentions of the environment and other matters, the anxiety that lies behind it as far as government's concerned is house building. What makes this even more sort of like outrageous in many ways is that there's almost guaranteed profit going to come out from that government tilt towards house building, but that isn't even enough for them. The landowners and developers are subsidized by, they're actually subsidized by huge subsidies, government subsidies, which is going to their sector and going to landlords. And there's been this huge expansion of the Help to Buy program, which subsidize new property owners. Homes England funds have been steered towards developers without really asking the question, do they really need this extra funding for infrastructure? Housing benefit, which runs at over 20 billion a year, mind you, is going into the hands largely of private landlords. And all of this is at the expense of social and environmental investment. That money could go somewhere else. Within a week, government policy could be changed, switch all that to, placemaking, meeting social and affordable housing and so on, but it's not. It's actually going into reinforcing this kind of property machine, which is then, kind of amplified by the property lobby. So that this is what we're faced with, is the finance house builder complex, which I've described earlier, and government have become interdependent. It's not as if government is in the business of regulating the finance and house builder complex. Quite the contrary. They're in close partnership with them, and they both need each other, and they both kind of got each other where they want them in many cases. And those on the outside of that, residents, communities, local authorities to a large extent, they're really sitting on the outside, almost powerless. So what can be done? I mean, this is a huge kind of, it's almost like a monster that has taken over decisions about the environment and made a mockery of the local planning system, made a mockery in many cases of public consultation and public participation. I mean, just see the Oxford Times last week about what people think about what is the point of public participation and local democracy if it can be overridden by these huge forces. So this is fundamentally a political problem, to change the balance of the economy away from property investment. I mean, that's going to take a massive rethink about, national economic policy. But in many ways, it makes complete sense. Why pour so much of the national, of national wealth into just this one sector of the economy at the expense of other sectors that really need it very badly? And the next job that needs to be done by any courageous government is to break up the house builders cartel, the cartel of 8 to 10 major volume house builders that operate, at a regional level and sometimes a local level as cartels, to control the amount of development that takes place, to manage their land banks so that they don't release too much land. That's one of the reasons why, of course, despite the fact that government has made it much, much easier for landowners to have their land allocated for housing, very little extra housing is actually built, because the house builder's model is underpinned by selectively releasing land and house building onto the market. So that's really fundamental, is to break up the house builders cartel so that their business model doesn't dominate everything that's going on and dominate, local plans. And the second part of any progressive agenda has to be to capture land value. I calculate around about 80 to 90% of all the land value generated by granting planning permissions does not stay in a community. It actually is taken by landowners and investors and developers, so that the huge value of land that's created by the planning system just disappears, really, and it's effectively stolen from local communities, and that balance has to be changed. If even 50% was returned to communities and to the public, that would be a lot fairer, and everybody would benefit from that. But sort of at a more local level, it's really important to support and highlight local campaigns, because there are campaigns that are taking on this system, and they're based upon this fundamental objective, is that you have to take land out of the speculative market. It's almost impossible to get anything out of the planning system or out of the development system unless somehow communities can take land out of the speculative market, because the price of land compared to the price of housing is like 70, 80% of the price of a house is land. So unless you can take land out of the speculative market by compulsory purchase, by gifting, by local authorities not selling their land but keeping it, then you've got a chance to show there is another way. And the example, there are many examples, but the ones I point to is Coin Street, 250 very low rent housing in the middle of London, all cooperatively owned on land which otherwise would have been in the speculative market and would be by now would be luxury housing and offices. Or a local government case, which is Goldsmith Street in Norwich, that won an architectural prize last year for basically very high quality council housing on council owned land, where all the value of that land is captured by the development that takes place, and its quality development and its proper placemaking. So proper placemaking can take place, but only if you take land out of the speculative market. The idea that you can have placemaking, and much has been written about this, when land is largely privately owned by volume house builders and investors, it's almost impossible for that to happen. I'm not saying it never happens, I'm saying it's very rare. And we've got to really say, if we're going to get proper placemaking, it has to be taking much more land out of the speculative market. That's fundamental. And in as much as there are local campaigns doing that and making that explicit, community land trusts, co-ops, some local authorities, non-profit housing organizations, some specialist housing providers, where they're taking land out of the speculative market, we can see remarkable things happen. But that goes against the grain of what's going on at the moment. Now, maybe, in the post-COVID world, when people are talking about, green recovery and rethinking things, using the horrible phrase, build back better, maybe this is an opportunity to reinstate planning as something that's really a necessary part of sort of building back, something that is sort of underpins a recovery, that prioritizes not land, the finance house building complex and their needs, but prioritizes healthy towns and cities and prioritizes the common good. So there it is. The Property Lobby book is available. I should say at all good bookstores if you can get to one, but can be obtained from the Property Press. I hope it could be a useful tool in the long battle that we're facing ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob. And you can get it online, I know, because I looked up tonight. So there are various ways in which you can get Bob's book. I would, before I hand over to Gillian to look at the chat that has been coming in and give Bob a chance to answer questions. First of all, I would love to know if any in the audience tonight would like to offer a counter narrative and defend the present system. That would be interesting. I was surprised to see that the chief executive of one of the big house builders was awarded an annual bonus, annual this is, of £70 million. There must be something slightly wrong. What did he do to deserve that £70 million, I wonder? But that I leave that hanging in the air. Thank you very much again, really stimulating. And now I'll hand over to Gillian. Over to you, Gillian.
Thank you, Clive, and thank you, Bob. That was a very interesting talk. Before I open up to questions from the audience, I'd like to ask you a question, because there's something that you haven't mentioned at all that does impact on what you're saying, and that's the two recent white papers that the government have brought out, Planning for the Future, and the most recent one, the Permitted Development. Do you have a view on these recent consultations, and what fear or maybe benefits would you have for Oxford if any of this legislation goes through, particularly the permitted development one? Bob.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked me that. The permitted development one, of course, has already gone through. And I mean, this is absolutely disastrous, of course, because this is really taking planning out of the planning system. Basically, it's saying there is going to be no planning control over extensive areas of changes of the built environment. In this case, town centres and industrial parks and things are basically now going to be pretty much free-for-alls. No planning application will be needed to change the use of buildings in town centres and shopping parades as a result of this new use classes order. So the permitted development right changes are, of course, precisely what the property lobby's been asking for years. They don't want planning controls, and the permitted development rights, they're absolutely delighted by it. I went into a kind of webinar seminar thing. Of course, you can go into some of these things of some of the developers a few weeks ago, and they could not believe that the government was giving these things to them. They just were like, this is incredible. We didn't think they were going to roll over so easily. So they're absolutely delighted by the permitted development rights. In relation to the white paper with its proposals about zoning and so on, this is slightly more problematic because it's so disruptive of the present system. And some developers are not so keen on that because it disrupts their current business model. And it may delay things and so on and so forth. So it's a slightly more complicated response. But what I anticipate that in the areas that the government regards as sort of areas that need leveling up, I would have thought those are the areas which will be, where there'll be these zones where you can get automatic planning consent. They're already talking about sort of a free port zones and all these kinds of zones which simplify planning zones and so on. So I think this liberalization, this sort of taking planning regulation away from local control is, very much part of the government's agenda, unfortunately. The developers, it's part of their agenda, but they also are perhaps slightly pragmatic at times because it could lead to more conflict. And they don't necessarily want that. There's enough conflict in the planning system as they see it. But yes, the white paper and the permitted development rights reforms are all part and parcel of the shift which has been encouraged by the property lobby over the last 40 years to liberalize the planning system, to reduce the amount of local democracy, to put them in the driving seat. Because it's very interesting in terms of these white paper reforms, right? It's going to be the house, if there is a concession made on zoning, it'll be because the house builders want it, not because we want it. It's because the house builders are knocking on the door, not just knocking on the door, sitting having coffees with them and drinks with them. It'll be them that the government say, oh no, we're not going to do the zoning thing. No, not because Oxford Civic Society have said it, because the house builders have said it. So they're still in the driving seat.
It seems very odd that they have a consultation that closed on the 28th of January, and then you're saying that, you know, they've approved it anyway. That just seems totally inappropriate, doesn't it? Anyway, shall we move on to questions? Because I have got quite a few. We'll start with the first question that came in from David Rogers. David, it's quite a long question, so I'm going to let you speak, and perhaps you can reduce the actual question itself. David?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Bob, thank you for your lovely, wonderful talk. Look, in today, 70% of what you pay for a house is for the land on which the house sits. House price inflation is really land price inflation. In the 1930s, it was only 2%. 2% of what you paid for a house was for the land. The government is forcing councils to sell publicly owned land. And since the Thatcher era you mentioned, the UK has sold off an area equivalent to 10% of the entire land area of the UK to private developers. This was cheap public land that could and should have been used for cheap public or social housing. The government has recently told local authorities to sell off yet more public land. How can we stop this? Because it seems to be our only chance to build inexpensive social housing, as in Coin Street and Goldsmith Street.
Bob?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely, and it is absolutely scandalous. Sorry, did you want me to answer that now or wait for other?
No, could you answer that, please? Yes, because all the questions are slightly different. Thank you.
Oh yeah, David. Yeah, David. Yeah, this has been in these kind of public land sales have been going on for many years, both in central government and government putting pressure on local authorities and so on to dispose of land. And in some ways, you know, local authorities, because they're in dire financial straits, has been only too happy to do it. So it's a kind of crazy, kind of vicious circle. What can be done to stop it? Well, I think it's time that some local authorities, and I'd like to see Oxford do it, is stand up and say they're not going to do it. We're actually not going to sell our land. And if you force us to do it, we'll take you to court on the ground that this land is actually needed to meet a social good. I think we need, local authorities need to challenge government on some of these things and not just roll over. Otherwise, I can't see how, you know, this land is going to be released into hands which are like the community land trusts and others. I mean, how are we going to get hold of the land unless the local authorities refuse to sell it?
Thank you. We have a question from Oliver Wright. Again, it's quite a long question, so I'm going to let you speak, Oliver, and if you can just pose it in a more concise way to Bob. It's about property prices.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll try and make it more concise, but I'll speak quickly.
Yes, I can.
Why isn't the answer to high property prices simply to allow developers to build to the market without requiring them to build affordable houses? Wouldn't that increase the overall supply of housing? And if you have an increase in supply, wouldn't that lead to a greater affordability, especially of older houses? Not so much the new houses, they will inherently be more expensive, but would it not divert demand from older houses towards new houses, as is the case with cars, for example?
Bob?
No, actually it won't. I mean, this is one of the kind of great myths perpetuated by the property lobby. They say, oh, we need more land, you know, so we can build more housing. By the way, they don't build more housing, they just get more land. But even if they do build more housing, prices don't fall, because it's partly because demand for these things for housing is so high, and because the amount of housing on the market is always limited, deliberately limited by the house builders, because they want to keep prices up. So the idea that they're going to build out their land banks is just madness. They would never do that, because it would reduce prices to an extent, and that the whole business model is based upon increasing values and increasing prices. That is the fundamental heart of their model. And as long as their model is running the country, which it is, there won't either be enough houses built, and prices and values will keep going up, as they have done for the last 40 or 50 years. So, you know, building out, if you built out every bit of greenbelt, if you did, it would make very, very little difference to property prices, partly because of those demand factors and partly because of the way in which the housing was built out by the house builders, and because there are other factors affecting, you know, housing supply and demand, not just the amount of housing, it's mortgage rates, it's other factors, there's local factors and so on. Yeah, this is a great myth that the developers are very keen on perpetuating, and a lot of local authorities, not of governments anyway, seem to buy into this myth and use it as justification for saying to local authorities, you must allocate more land for housing.
So the laws of supply and demand don't apply.
Does that answer your question, Oliver? I'm not sure.
Well, I know. I mean, I
They
don't
don't
understand
apply
how
in the
laws of
case
supply and
of a
demand
fixed
don't apply.
asset called land.
Okay, I won't hog it.
Well,
I don't understand.
They don't
your answer
apply
at all,
because
never mind.
it doesn't matter how much housing you build.
Well, that
Yeah.
can't be. Well, the laws of supply and demand don't
Okay.
apply. In other words, however elastic the supply is, price will not drop.
Okay, can we move on to another question? I've got a question.
Partly because if I can just have one other thing to.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair to Oliver, I have to just say this one thing, that most housing markets are really quite localized. If you take the Oxford housing market, right? I mean, under what circumstances would prices fall in the Oxford housing market? If you built up every piece of land around the Greenbelt in Oxford, do you really think houses in Oxford would fall to levels of just, let's say, I don't know, Macclesfield or something? They just never would.
No, because Oxford is never going to be Macclesfield.
The whole body of demand in a place like Oxford or Cambridge or
Oxford is there. There will always be.
Yeah, but that's why prices are not going to fall
Oxford is not
here.
Macclesfield.
Because
You
as
won't
long
have
as people
Macclesfield
want, as long as people want to live in Oxford.
Well, quite, but that's the demand.
Yeah, but Macclesfield prices are there because there isn't the demand there.
Quite. I mean, obviously, if demand increases,
yeah, but the demand is filtered
supply,
through the house builders and the landowners. Demand it. Yeah, but in the case of cars, right? If there's more demand, by the way, car prices don't particularly go down as either. But leaving that aside,
cars has gone up tremendous.
You know, if there's more demand, yeah, but they can at least, you can keep producing cars, and car companies want to produce more cars. The point about the house building industry, it doesn't want to produce housing because it's not part of their business model. They produce some housing,
incredible.
But a lot of their business model is based upon land ownership.
So you're saying the house building industry?
Well, it's not incredible. It's fact.
Houses.
It's fact. Just rip.
It seems incredible.
It wants to build a limited amount of housing to keep prices up.
But they can't do that. They don't control the market.
Well, it's not. Yes, it's incredible, but it's fact. It's not just me saying it.
I know.
Of course, they control it. They drip feed land and housing onto the market. It's called drip feeding.
But of course, they try to keep prices up. They're capitalists.
Studies being done for, you know. Well, exactly. That's what I'm talking about.
But that's
exactly what I'm saying. They keep prices up
industry
deliberately,
as well as in the property industry. It's how it operates in all industries.
Can we move on to another question?
Because manufacturers try to limit the number of cars built.
They try to keep prices up.
There is a sort of related question to this from an anonymous attendee who says, how can we plan properly to reduce dependence on cars when buses are deregulated and the Housing Investment Fund is mainly directed at roads? Do you have a view on that, Bob?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure the housing investment, I'm not sure quite what's meant by the housing investment fund is directed at roads. I'm not sure. I mean, the transport investment is directed probably at roads. It's not a field I know a huge amount about. But I don't think housing investment, in as much as housing investment is primarily car-based, I mean, housing investment is true. The volume house builders model is largely a car-based housing model, if that's what you're getting at.
It's an anonymous attendee. I can't identify who it is to ask them what they mean by their question. But perhaps we'll move on to another one if we can't do that. There is a rather interesting question. As we all know, there's lots of developments going on around the outside of Oxford in the Green Belt, and people are very concerned about it. And there's a proposed big development around Bayswater Brook. And there's a lot of consultation going on about that. And I know that there are a lot of people who are concerned about it. I'm just looking for the lady's question. Let me find it. Here we are. No, that's not it. Just bear with me for a minute, please. There we are. It's Nicola Mallows. So if I just unmute Nicola, she can ask a question. I think there are a few questions within what she's saying. Where is she? There she is. Nicola, would you like to address your question to Bob about the loss of arable land? Are you there? Nicola? Nicola? Okay, she's not there, so we'll move on to another question. There are a lot that have been, now, what's this? That's Nicola, are you there? No. There are a lot of concerns in the questions about building more houses, but you can't produce more land, so that's a bit of a conflict. Somebody's alluding to an article in The Guardian about investment value. Now, there's somebody who's come back on Oliver's question, who says, if we let the market control house building, how could we house our nurses, cleaners, and teaching assistants? That's from Susanna Prestel. And that's quite crucial for Oxford, because we know with the housing not being affordable for a lot of people who are on low incomes, that is an issue. And I guess we go back to the question, well, the comment that you made earlier about social housing. That has fallen enormously. Bob, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, this is a really important. It's a really important point about the kind of housing that's produced by the volume house builders, which is of a particular type. It's not aimed at people with special needs or special requirements or social housing. They reluctantly will provide some of that thing as part of Section 106 agreements and so on. But it's not part of their model to produce the kind of variety of housing that's actually needed, housing for young people, for people with mental health problems, for key workers that need to live close to their place of work and so on. That's not how their model works. So there has to be another means to provide that kind of housing in the right place at the right time. And the only people who are going to provide that is not the volume house builders, of course. It has to be the whole range of the social and charitable sector and government. And the social and charitable sector does not have the funding to provide this. Government has not provided the subsidies to that sector in the way that it's provided subsidies to the volume house builders. So that's another big switch has to be made. The variety of housing that's needed is not matched by the variety of housing being provided by the market.
One point of a question that Nicola asked, which we couldn't get in touch with her. She says, and I'm thinking about this in particular in connection with permitted development and thinking about Oxford. As charitable trusts, is it acceptable for Oxford colleges to use their land assets for unsustainable market-driven housing that never delivers the right housing? The connection I was thinking about permitted development is how it might impact if the colleges who own a lot of the properties around the city decided that they would turn over a lot of shops and businesses to dwellings. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, the way in which the colleges, and the particular case of St John's College at Oxford North, shows how wrong the system is, that the colleges that are charitable organisations, you know, don't pay the same level of tax that other, you know, companies do when they undertake development. Therefore, their development is way more profitable than non-charities who are undertaking development. And yet they don't provide more affordable housing. They don't provide more community facilities. They should be providing more because they're not taxed as much. And that's really a scandal. It's a moral scandal that the colleges don't pay their fair share into the community, as we saw at Oxford North, where they managed to force down the local authority from 50% affordable housing to 35% on the grounds they said their scheme would not be viable. But yet they themselves are a more viable developer, and the site was largely greenfield site, a more viable developer than a commercial development. So, you know, they should have been providing more housing, not less, more affordable housing, more social housing than less. But they were able to argue using, of course, the usual band of London consultants, Savills, and et cetera, that, you know, their scheme would not be viable if they provided 50% affordable housing. I mean, how can that be? I mean, it wasn't the case. They clearly were making much greater profits, but they were able to hide behind the usual viability studies conducted by Savills et al. This is the kind of collusion which is acting against the community on really key sites, major sites around the city. There aren't many of them, but these developers and their consultants operate in that way. It's totally cynical. It's all about the bottom line. And the big problem is that the planning system seems so powerless, and councillors seem so powerless to fight these things. And so as regards to the city centre and permitted development, I mean, who knows what's going to happen in the city centre? It's almost certainly, as you suggest, that that St John's College and others will exploit these opportunities and permitted development rights to convert buildings into residential. And the question is, who's going to benefit? What kind of residential is going to be? Is there going to be any planning benefit for the community? Are we going to get a look into these decisions? Or is it going to be, sorry, no permitted development rights, so the community won't be consulted? How can this be right? These are major sites in a historic city where we don't have the right, or will not have the right, to comment on what kind of change of use takes place. That cannot be right. And it's these kind of challenges that have to be made. You know, the system has become profoundly immoral and it has to be challenged.
Oh, yeah. There's a couple of questions, one from Clive Booth and one from James Fry, about can we learn from other countries, is Clive's question. And James Fry is saying, how is it that Germany, for example, apparently avoids this sort of property market distortion? James, would you like to expand on your question to Bob?
I mean, all I would say is that I understand that in Germany, people think renting is a perfectly decent alternative. House prices do not get bid up to absurd levels. And I'm not quite sure about the level of the rents, but from what I hear, it is a much more equitable system. And I think the same is true in Austria and to some extent in France, where blocks of flats, I believe, even in expensive areas, tend to have rent controls and remain accessible to a wide range of people. Why does it work there?
Clive, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, really
I
great
think-
question.
Just to say, Gillian, that I think in some countries, when land goes from agricultural to development, the law allows the local authority to have quite a big slice of that uplift, which in this country, of course, goes almost wholly, as Bob was saying, to developers. And that uplift is used to provide infrastructure and a better environment. That's how I understand it, but I defer to Bob.
Bob?
Yeah, I mean, these are great questions. These are great questions because, you know, again, over decades, a lot of planners have looked over to the European countries and said, how come they do planning so much better? And how come they don't have this speculative land market to the same extent that we do? How come they don't have such an adversarial system between local authorities and the developing community? I mean, it is extraordinarily adversarial, our system. And one of the reasons for that is that it is, yes, the renting thing is a factor, but one of the reasons is because it is accepted in the Netherlands and Germany, and in France actually as well, that the state has a very important role to play in actually providing land for housing, in many cases, actually in the case of the Netherlands, doing the land reclamation. So developers actually develop housing. They develop buildings. Developers are not involved in getting profits from land. This is the big problem with the British system, that developers are gaining profit from land and also from the building. In the Netherlands, land and building are separated, where the land is developed by the local authority, and then it sells service plots to developers to actually build out the housing. That means that land value capture is retained within the community. I mean, in Germany, they have a situation where, and again, they have much, in European countries, they have much more powerful mayors and city mayors and this kind of thing. Their local government system is way stronger than ours, which creates a whole different relationship, of course, between the people and developers. But in Germany, you can have a large site developed as an opportunity area. The local authority will then possibly acquire all the land, but at least will specify very exactly what kind of housing should be built there. So that it will say precisely the values of the houses that are built, the kinds of people are going to live there and so on. So it's very, very specific. It's not left to the market and the market to decide what kind of housing is built. In this country, it is not possible for a local authority to master plan a site and saying, you know, these are exactly the house prices that are going to operate in this site, or this is the tenures that are going to operate in this site. These kinds of things are very, very limited in this country, whereas in European countries, it is possible for the state at local and national level to be far more specific about what goes on in land. But their whole relationship to land is completely different. And that's the key difference, the relationship to land. And why don't we learn anything? There have been so many MPs and delegations gone across to the Netherlands. There's probably been 1,000 delegations, including MPs, ministers, consultants, planners. We've probably, all of you have probably been over to the Netherlands and seen what they've done. And they come back and nothing happens. Why is that?
We have another interesting question here from Gerald Kells about divorcing housing need from demographics. Gerald, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, and I should say that I did a lot of work for CPRE looking at this new standard methodology, which has been dropped now by the government, but was an attempt to move housing need further away from demographics and much more based on affordability. A real attempt and it just pushed more and more housing into expensive areas and away from where it was needed most, was my conclusion. I do wonder what your feeling about that is, Bob. And I was the person, I have the fantastic video, I just mentioned this, in The Guardian about house prices, and people who were interested in that question about house prices. It's a really fascinating article which explains why investment value rather than supply has driven housing prices. And it's really interesting. I put it in the chat, but I think you're absolutely right about that, Bob. So affordability. And
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you mentioned that video. I've seen that video. It is really useful. Yeah. I mean, this is, you know, this whole thing about the algorithm, about, you know, where housing should take place. And the government, you know, sort of has come rather unstuck with their suggestion. And, you know, it does make more sense to rediscover the idea of housing need, I would have thought. The top priority is to establish what we mean by housing need and to try and focus resources into the places where they have the highest need. So I think the whole thing needs to be completely rethought, because the top priority,
We seem to have lost you, Bob. Bob?
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
now I can.
Am I back?
You're back
Yes, you
now.
are.
Yes.
I'm just
Yeah.
going to
So Gerald, I think Gerald, you were going to
You
say,
go.
sorry?
no, I was just going to say, because I looked at
I was trying to.
I looked at every local authority in the country, and some authorities, the amount of housing based on need and the housing based on affordability had gone up to 100% increase for affordability above what was needed. So a huge amount of housing was not for need, it was for this affordability calculation. It was absolutely massive. Had it gone through, and that was what the aim was for developers, I think.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that was what was the aim, was to encourage, you know, the volume house builders, because they want to build housing that's profitable, not housing that meets needs. That's not, it's not their job. I mean, it's not the job of the house builders to meet housing need. The job of the house builders is to make profits for their shareholders. And, you know, government has got to stop thinking about, we've got to stop thinking about the housing problem is going to be solved by the volume house builders. Not their job. That's the job of society to say, you know, how, what, where housing should be built. And the government has sort of basically given away that responsibility in many ways to the volume house builders, hence the algorithm that came out, which is basically encouraging them to build more housing in areas where it was profitable. And whereas in fact, we've got to start building housing in places which it may not be profitable or may not be as profitable. I mean, that's the other point, is that house builders are always looking for the maximum amount of profit. Imagine there was a house builder that actually operated on the basis of a kind of a reasonable profit. They always build in 20%, by the way, automatically as profit. That's one of the highest automatic profit levels of any commercial sector in the country. Let's say they said, actually, we're going to reduce that from 20% to 10%. Imagine how much value would be liberated for the country if they reduced their profit take by just 10%. By the way, 10% is a pretty healthy profit. So, you know, I'm afraid the system is operated largely by greed. And what we've got to do is society's got to demand that planning is based on need, first of all, and then, you know, try to kind of regulate the house builders in the best way that they can. Certainly not to hand over responsibility to the house builders. That's not a job. They probably don't even want to do it, but, you know, they're glad to have it. That's what the property lobby says. We'll take it. If you're offering that, we'll take it. And, you know, the disasters all around.
There's a related question here from Mev McMahon, talking about the property lobby. Mev, would you like to pose your question?
Yeah, my question was seeing how land is being taken up. How much of a threat is there to public lands right now? Specifically, I'm thinking about parks along waterfronts and other very quote unquote valuable pieces of land.
Yeah. Well, I don't know I wouldn't like to say that there's automatically a threat to designated public open space.
Oh, I see.
I was unmuted.
Oh, right. Oh, I see. But we couldn't see you, of course.
James,
Mav,
could you
don't say
unmute,
it's up
please?
to you.
Or rather
I
mute.
don't think there is a threat.
Okay. He liked your question.
Yep. No, like yours.
James, can you mute yourself, please?
We're enjoying your conversation
Hello.
at the moment.
It's an interesting conversation, but probably private. Sorry, Bob. We interrupted you there.
Yeah. Okay. Mav asked this important question about whether or not, there's a threat to public open space, green space, riverbanks, waterfronts, and so on. It's a good question. I think probably where local authorities have got tough policies on public open space, they probably can resist development taking place at the moment. But as we know, playing fields, one has to put big qualifications around this. Remember, school playing fields got sold off in quite large numbers about 6 or 7 years ago. And of course, a lot of waterfronts are publicly, even if they're publicly owned, have been sold off, in the Docklands and so on. And British Waterways Board has been selling land off. Yeah, I mean, sites are being picked away at. And it's really important that local authorities have tough policies, because one thing that we've learned over years of going to planning inquiries and things, that if plans are not very precisely drawn up and boundaries really clearly drawn, they are really, in other words, really tight, legally tight, developers will find their way through. But I think public open space has probably got pretty high priority. I would think in Oxford it'd be quite difficult to build on Port Meadow, but areas surrounding it, that might be a different story. So yeah, you have to be very, very vigilant. I think everything else that's not down there as public open space, and I mean seriously designated as serious public open space, certainly a place like Oxford and in the high demand areas of the southeast, is under scrutiny, very, very careful scrutiny. Developers will have, loads of people going around, land agents and others, sniffing out properties absolutely everywhere. Your property, my property, up and down the streets, they know everything. And they're feeding this information through to house builders, big and small. So one has to be vigilant. But the planners themselves have got to be vigilant as well and make quite sure their plans are very, very carefully drawn up so as to resist undesirable development.
I have a question here from Toomey Hawk, and that follows on from what you're saying about, local government standing firm. He or she, forgive me, says, how do you propose that local government, oops, it's gone, hang on a second. Sorry, it's gone off the screen. Toomey, would you like to pose your question to Bob yourself?
Hi, good evening. Yes, the question really is, how do you propose that local government actually makes a stand against the central government so that we can change our focus from meeting government targets to actually building based on housing need? I mean, I ask that because I'm the cabinet member for planning at South Cambs District Council. You know, we're always under this fear of being, you know, not having enough 5-year land supply, and then, you know, policies become out of date, and then there's speculative development. And frankly, we are tired of that, but we also have the targets we have to meet. So how do we make a stand? I mean, what do we need to do? How do we do it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and I suppose you have to start off by just saying no, and finding, first of all, there are many people in the community will support you saying no if you're saying no with good reasons. So for a start, you've got a lot of people behind you if you say no. And then you have to start looking for allies elsewhere. Other local authorities may feel the same way. Who knows, the LGA might even support you, I don't know. But if you're going to make a stand, you've really got to do it by developing an alliance of people who are going to crowdfund a legal challenge to government, in the same way that the Good Law Project on this very day has crowdfunded a challenge to the government's procurement process on around COVID, and they literally crowdfunding thousands of pounds to take the government to court in a case that's regarded as a hopeless case, but maybe it's not, because they've actually gone out and asked for money all over the place. And this is the only way to do it, is to say no. I mean, Islington, for example, in 2016, was it? They said no to the government about the definition of viability. And it went to the High Court, it went to the Appeal Court, and finally they won. Against the odds, against the, you know, this is the high tide of the Osborne attack on planning, and they won. So you can win, but it's going to cost. You're going to need allies. I'll support you. It's not easy. It's a political statement. This is politics.
Can I just chip in there? Can I just chip in there, Bob? You know, there's this, in that consultation paper, there was this thing about reducing scrutiny and public consultation, and possibly this devolution white paper, which would introduce unitary councils, which would take control away from bodies such as Toomey's part of. Do you worry about that? Should we worry about that in terms of local government?
I think it should be. I mean, there's something to be said for unitary councils in some circumstances. I mean, obviously, it's highly political. You know, it depends on the kind of political composition of the new unitary that's created. There's a lot to be said for putting together transport and education with planning. I mean, the separation between county councils and district councils on these things, does it make any sense? It probably doesn't. But yet, you know, it's a political decision. And in Oxford, for example, although there is a logic to the unitary authority covering the whole of Oxfordshire, let's say one unitary authority comes in, then the downside of it is, of course, it takes out of circulation a large Labour-held authority called Oxford City Council, and dilutes that enormously. And so there is a kind of political price to be paid for a unitary authority in that case. In other cases, there may be less political price to be paid, and it may make good sense. So I think it's difficult to generalize, actually, sorry. I just think it's difficult to generalize.
Gillian, I'm conscious that we've had an excellent run.
I was just about to hand back to you, Clive.
Well, no, it's fine. I didn't want to cut it off, no. but we've had some very good chat contributions, as well as some excellent questions, and I was very keen to let it run on. I mean, the fact that it's gone on as long as it has is a measure of the level of interest, and I'd particularly like to to thank Bob for being so stimulating. I'm so sorry that we had the technical glitches early on, and thank you everybody for your patience. We will be mounting the talk on the web, including the slides, and I know 1 or 2 people had problems seeing the slides. So as soon as we have a chance to edit tonight's talk and take out the bits that didn't work sound-wise, we will be putting it up for everybody to look at. But I'd like to say thank you very much to the audience for your stimulating chat and questions. Thank you to my colleagues and Gillian. And I hope that we can return to this subject in a while because it's not going to go away, and it is one of burning importance to particularly young people who are suffering so many setbacks this time, that this is just another thing that they have to put up with, the possibility that they're never going to be able to own their own homes. But if they were living in Germany, perhaps they wouldn't want to own their own homes. I'll leave it at that, but thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Bob. And I usually say safe journey home, but on this occasion, I hope you are already home, and good night.